Welcome back to What Happens Next, the podcast that examines some of the biggest challenges facing our world and asks the experts what will happen if we don't change and what can we do to create a better future. I'm Dr. Susan Carland. Keep listening to find out what happens next.
You know, when someone comes into a hospital and they're hemorrhaging, you know, you can give them a blood transfusion, but the best thing is to actually stop the bleeding. So to me, the number one thing is we absolutely have to stop carbon emissions.
So if we can reduce food waste, we can all actually reduce CO2 emissions, and we can feed people who are hungry, and we can reduce water usage. So the benefits are enormous.
You know, we're all active players in the food system, so we need to demand more localised food systems, and we actually have a lot of power to do that.
It's not a response that fits with one, shall I say, government department or one area of government or one area of society. I think collectively we all have a role to play.
In our first episode on the future of food, we discussed why more people are experiencing food insecurity than ever before. Australia's food system is wasteful, and the global food system is badly broken due to the effects of climate change, political unrest, COVID recovery, and more. Today, you'll hear more from some of the change makers on the front lines of food, the people working to improve the underlying causes of food insecurity, provide emergency food relief, and even shape the future of agriculture. First up, Professor Ros Gleadow. You met Ros in our last episode, but I'm going to let her introduce herself again because you need to hear this.
My name's Ros Gleadow. I'm a professor in the School of Biological Sciences at Monash University, and I'm a plant scientist. And I study the effect of climate change on plants that can kill you.
One of Ros's pet plants is cassava. She told me it was domesticated originally in South America, where they've been eating it for thousands of years. These days, it's also the staple crop for about 40% of sub-Saharan Africa.
It's everywhere, and it's eaten increasingly in the Pacific, where it is, to some extent, displacing taro in part of the diet.
And my understanding is that cassava could be a really useful crop as climate change becomes more of a problem and the planet starts to warm. Is that correct?
It's a fantastic crop for tolerating high temperatures, not very good at high salinity, so not good where the sea level rises, so some parts of the Pacific, but very good at high temperatures, very tolerant of drought, so it's fantastic crop like that. The downside is that it's poor nutritionally.
Are there any other downsides to cassava?
It produces toxic cyanide. Quite a lot of plants do that, but cassava is the only staple crop that can kill you if it's not processed properly.
Do you think that as we start to see cassava perhaps used more globally as climate change increases, that there might be the risk of increased cyanide poisoning in the population?
Yeah, well, I mean, 1 billion people eat cassava every day, and every day probably I'm sure somebody dies from eating cassava, and certainly there are thousands and thousands of people with a disease called konzo when people eat a lot. So during the harvest season, it's much worse during times of drought, and also during times of political conflict. And the reason for that is, well, through drought, the plant is actually making more cyanide and is more toxic in itself, but also there's less availability of other foods. So cassava is a great food for carbohydrate. If you're just looking at like food security from a point of view of enough calories, yeah, it's good, but it needs to be eaten with other things that have protein that enable you to detoxify the cyanide, because body can detoxify cyanide, but you need protein to be able to do that.
How would you define food insecurity, Ros?
So food insecurity, in the technical definition, my understanding is not having a reliable source of food. But it's not just the number of calories, it's actually the food has to be suitably nutritional as well. So you need to have a balanced diet. So food security is to do with the availability of food, the ability to access food, stable supply of food. So food may be available, but if you don't have any money or you don't have transport to get to markets, you may be food insecure.
If we're going to feed the next generations, we'll need to rethink our agriculture, starting literally from the ground up.
It's important to think, we can't just grow more food and take more land, because we have to really work out how to increase productivity of food crops and improve efficiency of food chains and reduce waste in order to make sure we don't take more land, because we need to preserve biodiversity. There's a lot of, apart from itself, biodiversity itself has a right to exist, but also it disrupting biodiversity increases the chance of those diseases jumping from animals to humans. We have disruptions to climate. We have all kinds of things. So I think the balance there is very important. There's two types of farming in the world. There's the smallholder farms, which actually accounts for more than half of the world agriculture, and they can be improved in efficiency by adding fertiliser and more better varieties. The other is the big broadacre farming, and that's been fantastic for really big production of food and has been the result of the Green Revolution. But what we really need is improved efficiency of using fertilisers exactly perfectly, harvesting exactly perfectly. And there are a lot of new technologies out there, robotics, detection from satellites or drones that can actually agricultural technologies that can really monitor and deliver efficiencies that are beyond what we're currently seeing. And I think that, together with the development of very targeted genetically modified crops that could be bred to be very drought tolerant and so on, I think there's a lot of opportunity for increasing the efficiency of production without increasing land area or increasing the inputs of fertiliser, because that's what we need. More crop production with less inputs. And I think that is possible.
What's getting in the way of developing more of those?
One of the handicaps that we've got in developing new crops is that there's not enough plant scientists in the world. There's quite a shortage, and a lot of countries around the world have been cutting teaching in these areas. And there's currently a world shortage of botanists and plant scientists, and particularly plant pathologists, people who work on plant diseases. And so there really needs to be an investment, public investment in education around the world in those areas. So for the last 30 years, we have about 3% increase in crop yields year on year through the valiant efforts of plant breeders around the world. What we really need is more people working in that space, so more people working in plant breeding. We need people in public breeding programs, because a lot of the space for the big crops is taken up by companies, and we need to diversify into other crops, some that are more drought tolerant. Cassava's one, but there are many others that are very drought tolerant or very salt tolerant, and reduce our reliance on just such a few crops. 3 crops basically supports most of the world. So there are complexities in this, but I think it is solvable. But we do have to really invest in developing the crops and in getting the systems in place. But above all, the thing driving this is rising carbon dioxide. When someone comes into a hospital and they're hemorrhaging, you can give them a blood transfusion, but the best thing is to actually stop the bleeding. So to me, the number one thing is we absolutely have to stop carbon emissions. We have to reduce them rapidly, and we have to be actively doing research way beyond my area of research to actually pull the carbon dioxide down much lower than it is today. I think those things are really crucial. We really have to do those things.
Hi, I'm Ian Carson. I am lucky enough to have been a co-founder of Second Bite and a Monash alumni, and Second Bite rescues fresh, nutritious food.
So how do the supermarkets or the markets, how do they decide What's not good enough for us to sell but is okay to give second bite?
So it's not really the supermarkets, it's us.
Okay.
It's the consumers. I don't blame the supermarkets, I actually blame us. And actually the supermarkets have responded really well. If we go back 15 years, they weren't doing anything, but with us and others, they've become really part of the solution. So most of the food which gets wasted in supermarkets actually is collected now. So we've actually solved a lot of that problem. It's a great story that the supermarkets actually, and a lot because their staff demanded it, have solved most of that problem and are helping charities like us to do even more. And so now the focus is on helping the consumer to work out how they can do more, and also on between the grower, the farm gate, and the supermarket.
So what is happening on that journey from the grower to the farm gate? Is it getting damaged in transit? Is it the farmer saying, I can tell no one will want this wonky banana and chucking it out? What's happening there?
It's a combination of things. So one is the consumers won't buy something which doesn't look right. So it's that's one. Two, it's sometimes markets that the product is being, they can't sell it at the right price, so it's cheaper for the farmer to plough it in. There are millions of tonnes of bananas which go to landfill every year because the cost of getting them to market, or they're not the right shape, etc. And there are more and more things being done. And then it's, crops which fail, where the fruit, isn't good enough, or it's that there's floods. We've had the recent flooding, and the supply chain disruption. So the last couple of years, and one of your things was COVID, there's been massive disruptions to pickers, to transport. We've had the floods, so people couldn't go and collect things. So there are a whole variety of problems or opportunities to be solved from the farmer through to the supermarket, and for the farmer to know that there are solutions and to have easy solutions. I mean, in some ways, food rescue at scale only started about 15 to 20 years ago. So it's not that long that we've been on this journey. And, some industries, they've been going for 200 years. So everyone's learning how to redo the whole supply chain. And, the good news is that there are a lot of people who are trying to do things about this. So there's probably never been more focus on it, which is interesting, Susan, because when we started, people didn't really get it. And so we spent years talking to people about it. When I was a student at Monash University, we were looking at ways of feeding homeless people. But it's taken all that time for society to really understand how bad the problem is.
What do you think happens if we don't try to address food insecurity in Australia? What do things look like in the next 20 years?
Well, the amazing stat is that if food waste in the world was the CO2 emissions from food waste was a country, it would be the third biggest emitter in the world. Third biggest emitter of CO2 emissions. So if we can reduce food waste, we can all actually reduce CO2 emissions, and we can feed people who are hungry, and we can reduce water usage. So the benefits are enormous. And often people worry that individuals are powerless and can't make a difference. But actually, every day an individual can make just a little difference.
Yeah.
So your question was, what's
If we
the world
don't
looks
change,
like
yeah.
if we don't change? Well, if we want to reduce global warming, 8% of it is food waste. So we can all do something about global warming just in our fridges.
We could do something by, as you said, stopping wasting the food that we bring home, stopping buying that bag of spinach that we inevitably chuck out a week later. We can be less superficial about the produce that we buy at the supermarket and buy the wonky banana. Is there anything an individual like me could do to help address that issue between farmer to shop where things, there's a lot of drop off and waste there too? Is there anything I can do in that area?
It's a great question. So there's a few things that individuals can do, you could do. One is people could donate to Second Bite or other agencies. That's a really simple thing. A couple of dollars a week makes a difference because we're going to the farmers. The second thing is we can educate ourselves on how to reduce food wastage. And if you go on the Stop Food Waste Australia website, which is a national initiative which all the food rescue agencies are a part of, that will tell you how to reduce your own wastage. And then it's a matter, the other thing that we can do is grow vegetables in our gardens. I know I've got a friend who during COVID, he dug up his lawn and turned it all into vegetables, and he does that with his kids now. So he's growing tomatoes and lettuces and cauliflowers. So growing our own vegetables is a very rewarding thing to do. And if you really wanted to, if you grow your own vegetables, you could actually donate them to an agency nearby. So that would be really, really powerful. So I think the Stop Food Waste Australia website is a good one for people to have a look at. There are also some food sharing apps. There's a thing called Olio, and there are others where if you've got surplus food in your home, you can put it up and people can access it. So you can share it with other people. So there are some good food rescue apps. And I think, talking about the waste and asking, when you go to a shop, asking, what do you do with your waste? Because one of the reasons why, say, Coles changed was because their employees said to them, what can we do about it?
Yeah.
And Coles, to their credit, listened to it.
Yeah.
So if we ask the questions, people start to think about it. There's a lot happening in the space. It's actually exciting because every day there's innovation and improvements in what's happening.
So you feel hopeful about the future of food security?
I'm so hopeful and so optimistic because I think that people such as yourselves people are interested in it and they want to know how they can help themselves and they know they can make a difference. So I think that's the great story about, Second Bite and food rescue is, and the really interesting thing about it is that when we started, the food industry in Australia is probably $200 billion, right? And it was a couple of Monash alumni and a couple of others who disrupted the whole food industry. Just imagine that. It wasn't the government. It wasn't the big supermarkets. It wasn't the manufacturers. It was a couple of Monash alumni who said, how can we fix this problem? And I think that's a great story. It wasn't just us, it was others. But isn't that amazing that individuals can make that difference?
Food rescue operations like Second Bite are a good option for short-term emergency relief, but they don't address the root causes of food insecurity. Here's Dr. Sue Cleaver of the Department of Nutrition, Dietetics and Food in Monash University's Faculty of Medicine, Nursing and Health Science.
This is a basic human right, and it needs to have that dignity, have that choice. And, yes, there is a need for a food safety net, exactly for what you were saying, in times of emergency, but as an ongoing response of what we're seeing. And it's not only in Australia, it's also other high-income countries, that this is not going to solve the issue in the long term. So that's why it's really important that we start to really think long and hard around how can we actually address this? Quite often the issue of food insecurity is called a wicked problem. By a wicked problem or a complex problem means that there's no one easy solution.
So what are some things that you've seen either happening in Australia or around the world which you think are really thoughtful, effective solutions to some of these food insecurity problems that you'd like to see implemented more broadly?
Yeah. Look, I think as I said before, there's always a place we need a food safety net, so like a food relief safety net in that shape or form. But how that looks, I think we can actually certainly improve on that. And there's some really great examples that are starting to happen here in Australia, but also what we're seeing internationally as well. So things like social supermarkets. So
What's a social supermarket?
Yeah, so they are sort of increasing, particularly within the UK. So it's almost like this medium in between a regular sort of supermarket, but what they have is perhaps foods that may be close to use by dates, that sort of thing. So people are able to have that choice. They're purchasing, purchasing foods.
Right.
There still is that variety. So there's some examples of that are happening. And I know in South Australia there's actually they're actually kind of testing that model as part of a larger research kind of project to see how that might work. I think even in the space of our existing kind of food relief, because we know that a lot of that relies on the charitable food sector and charity, that there is a role to play with that. But I think it's thinking about how those services are designed, how they, do they give people choice? And certainly through a lot of the work that I've done in talking with people around this experience, that choice is really important.
There's a dignity in choice.
There is, absolutely. It's very powerful. And the fact that the quality of the products, meat, are kind of, they're still fresh, they're still something that, many people might take for granted.
And also imagine what people want as opposed to being given a box of food and you get what you get.
Yeah.
Being able to go in and choose what you want, to sort of tick that box we were talking about earlier about what's culturally appropriate just for me as an individual or as a family. What do I want in my pantry? Not what do you want to give me?
Yeah, more broadly sort of internationally to sort of like target some of those kind of bigger kind of determinants. Scotland are testing a model around what they're calling a cash transfer to households. So I think that's something that's who are sort of living within that that sort of poverty line in particular. And so it's also helping to lift people out of that poverty thing. And I think that's something that if we look at the Australian Council of Social Service here in Australia, their Raise the Rate policy and advocacy campaign is so important because I think during COVID, some of those social welfare reforms that came in, we can see the impact that had for many households. And for the first time, they could afford a fridge, they could buy a freezer, they could, select, buy fruit and veg regularly. So that's the thing. I mean, that's the other thing too is, people are having to make this, I almost call it like a walking a food security tightrope. It's like walking this tightrope. So all these decisions that people are having to navigate around, well, is it the medication that we do, we pay for? Is it, is it the rent? Is it that big bill, that bill shock that came in? We know the utility costs are increasing. So it's all this navigational kind of and stress that households are constantly under and then having to think, well, do I do this or do I put food on the table? So it can be really tricky.
Imagine if we don't do anything to improve food security in Australia or around the world. What do things look like in the next 50 years?
Oh, look, I'm the optimist, and I like to say in my crystal ball, I would like to say that we're working, that we can put things in place. We can start to address some of those key things around, ensuring people have adequate housing, people are getting, a better income, employment stability, that we do have those support systems there for people. I think the challenge of if we don't start to do some of those things is that it continually falls back on the individual. And that what we actually need, it's not a response that fits with one, shall I say, government department or one area of government or one area of society. I think collectively we all have a role to play in this. And I think one of the challenges, I think particularly for governments, is that we need to get out of this silo. Okay, it doesn't just fit with health, or it doesn't fit with social welfare. It fits across housing, jobs, etc.
To take Sue's point even further, this isn't a problem for governments or scientific bodies to tackle alone either. Everybody eats, and everybody can make an impact on food security.
So my name's Liza Barber, and I work here at Monash University in the Department of Nutrition, Dietetics and Food. So I'm a dietitian in the area of public health, nutrition and food sustainability systems. I mean, our food system at the moment is predominantly this industrialised food system, and we need, we're all active players in the food system, so we need to demand more localised food systems, and we actually have a lot of power.
But what can we do? What can the average person at home do?
My 5 top tips would be around promoting a sustainable food system. In Australia, we all need to eat less meat. We need to eat more plants. And my second top tip would be to opt for nude kind of whole foods where you can.
By nude, you mean?
Unpackaged. So there's been this massive global proliferation of ultra-processed foods, and those are those really heavily packaged foods. They're really high in salt, sugar, fat, all the
They want to taste amazing.
Exactly, all the yummy things. They're marketed really cleverly. And a third top tip is around minimising your household's food waste. So lots of things we can do there. And then number 4 is to put a face to your food. And this is something I talk to my kids about all the time is, there's human beings behind the food that we're all eating. And so getting to know those people helps us really value our food. So going to a local farmer's market or your farm gate trails, that sort of thing. And then lucky last is to for all of us just to get our hands dirty. So there's no better way to understand the true value of our food than to watch how long it takes for a tomato to grow or to prepare that soil, get it ready for sowing seeds, that sort of thing. It's a really tactile, therapeutic, beautiful thing to do to connect us to where our food comes from.
Liza also wants us to start talking about politics at the dinner table, or rather, talking to politicians about the dinner table.
I would say to get involved in your local politics, which I know it sounds a bit left of field to start talking about politics with food, but it's all great for some of us to adopt these practices, but our food system is so disrupted that we actually need a big population shift towards more healthy and sustainable diets. And so if you can kind of advocate to your local government authority to start, the best practice is to create a food system strategy for your local government area. We've got some awesome examples in Australia. The city of Greater Bendigo has an incredible food system strategy, and they've just received a designation with UNESCO's Creative Cities in the category of gastronomy to really acknowledge the amazing work that they've done here in Bendigo. But yeah, really cool things happening overseas as well. So I guess, just advocating and telling our local politicians that this is important to us. We want our kids to be able to enjoy healthy local food as well. And at the moment, it's just not looking like future generations are going to have that privilege.
So the next time you're at the supermarket, buy the wonky banana. Use the sniff test on your milk instead of going by the best by date. And maybe get your hands a little dirty in the garden. The future may depend on it. Thanks to all our guests on this series, Dr. Sue Cleaver, Liza Barber, Ian Carson AM, and Professor Ros Gledo. Visit our show notes for more information about their work and links to the resources they mentioned today. And thank you for joining us for our series on the future of food. We'll be back next week with an all-new topic. Enjoying what happens next? Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share the show with your friends.